Hey guys, welcome to week 7 of Introduction to Philosophy, and this week finds us returning to 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who is a part of a longer historical tradition within Western philosophy that emerged in the 17th century, known as British Empiricism, which was opened up in large part due to a kind of critical response to the metaphysical speculation that we see demonstrated through, for example, Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. So this week I'm going to give you 2 lecture videos. The first, a kind of general overview of British empiricism and a locating of Hume within that trajectory. And then the second, I'll walk you through a careful unpacking of Hume's argument, which gives us the famous problem of induction in the history of philosophy. So to turn to the virtual whiteboard here really quickly, within epistemology, we've already had the opportunity to engage with 2 positions in that field. Rationalism, according to which knowledge comes from reason or intellect, and empiricism, of which Hume is a proponent, as well as John Locke, according to which knowledge comes from sense experience. Now, Descartes is a rationalist, as we've seen. Metaphysics, which is the field of philosophy that asks questions about the fundamental nature of reality, gives us 2 positions of its own, and this is rather simplified, of course. Realism, which says that there is, most basically, there is a mind-independent reality. According to the contrary position, idealism, and by the way, there are many approaches to both realism and idealism within these broad frameworks. So we shouldn't be too reductive here, but I'm speaking in quite broad terms here. Idealism says that there is no mind-independent reality, that reality as such and the objects that populate it are simply ideas in some mind or consciousness. So we'll talk about realism, a few approaches to that, and one version of idealism today, as these emerged from within these debates, connecting rationalism to the British empiricist tradition. So we get an early version of so-called realism in fact, Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, Descartes was a realist, and we might not be too clear about this at this point, given that we really only had occasion to stay within the first 2 of his meditations, and so we didn't get the full argument. However, in the 3rd meditation, close to the very beginning, within, I think, the 3rd paragraph, Descartes outlines, without using the specific terminology or language, what commentators have referred to as naive realism. And so naive should in fact be interpreted here as negative or pejorative. Now, the naive realist position says not only because this would be realism proper, realism most fundamentally or abstractly, namely the idea that there is a mind-independent reality. The naive realist goes a step further and says, there is a mind-independent reality and it exists in precisely the way my mind apprehends it, or my experience manifests it. And so Descartes says, there is no error in thinking, for instance, as he did before the first meditation, that there is a world, that there is a world in his mind, in his perception, in his memory, in his sensory openness to things. There is a sun, there is a sky, there are stars, birds, sandwiches, pants. His body is a real thing. Remember, he never said that those were erroneous ideas in themselves. Rather, the mistake comes about when he ascribes to the content of those ideas some externally existing object out there in the world. So in other words, if I were to ingest copious amounts of some kind of psychotropic drug like LSD and suddenly thought that I saw the now sadly late Little Richard dancing in the corner of my living room, from Descartes' perspective, his criticism of naive realism here, it's not wrong that at that moment I perceive, however impossible it might be, Little Richard dancing in my living room. The mistake comes when I say, that is, take the added unwarranted step and say, not only am I perceiving little Richard right now in my living room, but there is, in fact, outside of my consciousness or perception, some externally existing thing, which I'll call little Richard, that would exist in my living room even if I weren't here to see it. So that's the naive realist view, which I prepared a little fun picture to work with on this. So from the naive realist structure, you've got three elements. So on the one hand, you've got the subject or the perceiver. On the other hand, over here, you've got the object or the perceived. And a distillation of the naive realist perspective is that the subject makes direct contact or has immediate access, so makes direct contact with or has immediate access to the outside world. So let's say you're taking a walk in a park, you happen upon a tree, you say, I perceive a tree before me, and that's an expression of the material fact that through the sense modality of vision, you are making immediate contact to the world. So your eye somehow picks up a visual species, as they used to say, that's emitted by the object, and on that basis, you apprehend the object actively contacting it, you might say. Now, there's a problem with this view, and we've already talked about the problem in the context of the first meditation. So if naive realism is a true perspective on how things work in terms of one's perceptual engagement with things or one's consciousness of objects in the world, then errors would be impossible. If reality exists in precisely the ways I apprehend it, then there could be no gap between my consciousness and the things of which I am conscious, the things that appear within the frame of that consciousness. But I know just on the basis of my own experience of the world, I quite often make mistakes. And so these are the canonical examples of the illusory status of sense experience that we rehearsed in the course of that first meditation. So you see a stick in the water, it appears visually to be quite bent, although you know that's an illusion, and you could figure it out by reaching your hand in and removing it from the water. Or just on the basis of bare sense perception itself, when I look towards the sun, it appears to be an object that's quite small in size, almost as if I could reach up and grab it. But again, that's an error brought about by the great distance between the object of my perception and my awareness itself. So since naive realism doesn't have space for human error or mistakes in judgment, and we know that we do make mistakes, it can't be a tenable theory. Now, Descartes, in the second meditation, lays out the rudiments for a view that later commentators refer to as representationalism or representational realism, and this was only codified in a systematic and satisfactory way by John Locke, who was very much, although an empiricist, influenced by some of the, you might say, phenomenological work carried out by Descartes in his meditations. So remember in the second meditation, in the context of the ball of wax thought experiment, once the ball of wax is brought close to the fire, all of the so-called secondary qualities by which you apprehend the thing are radically transformed. So in other words, the color is different, the taste is different, the smell is different, the tactile feel or texture is also quite different. Nevertheless, you're able to perceive that it's the same substance. You can do this only by eliminating or abstracting away from your consideration those fallible secondary qualities, which are just too entangled with your subjectivity. And what that leaves you with are what Locke would later refer to, of course, building on what Descartes has given us, as the primary qualities of a thing. In other words, the quantifiable, mathematizable properties by which two subjects or individuals can come to objective or unanimous agreement on the truth of the object under consideration. So here's a picture of representational realism. So according to this model, there are three elements for every perceptual or conscious act. So on the one hand, over here, you've got subject or perceiver, just like in the model of naive realism. God, this mirroring is so annoying. And then you've got the tree, so the second one. But now you have, let's pull it back a bit. Now you've got a third item, the representation or idea. And so you're taking a walk in the park. In your experience, you happen upon a tree. Now what really happens is, again, those strange visual species somehow emit from the tree to your optical apparatus. And this causal process gives rise to the third term, in which you have a mental image, say, of the tree. And that is the representation or the idea. So according to the model of representational realism, perception is always mediated through a representation or an idea. So in short, one never makes direct, immediate sensory or intellectual contact to objects out in the world, but our experience is always mediated through this third term, the content of this third term, representations or ideas. Now, it might not be obvious, but a deep skeptical issue arises here. And that is, if it's true that we never have immediate sensory access to objects out there in the world, but only our ideas of them or our mediated representational concepts of them, then we can never step outside of these representations or ideas in order to compare them to the represented objects or things out there in the world that they're supposed to be mediating or manifesting for us. In other words, since we can never compare our representations to the things represented, we can never be sure that we're actually enjoying an accurate representation of reality. It could be that our ideas or representations, the only thing to which we have access in our experience and navigation of the world, it could be that those representations are entirely perverse. They're entirely obscure or fundamentally different from the content they're supposed to be revealing to us. In which case, this opens up a profoundly worrying skeptical disorientation of our place in the world and the veracity of our representations, and thus the substance or content of our understanding itself. Now, Locke had a kind of answer to this himself, and that was this intellectual process of abstraction, right? So according to Locke, there are things that exist out there in the world, even if we only have access to them because of the properties or qualities that are manifested. We never get access to the object underlying those qualities, like the cushion that holds pins, for instance, if you're into sewing. But if we abstract away all those potentially illusory secondary qualities, the color, the sound, the taste, the texture, then we are left with only the mathematizable, which is to say then the truly knowable. So through the process of abstraction, we can in any case achieve true knowledge of reality as it exists, even independently of the structures of human consciousness. There's a problem with that, though. As we'll see in the next video, we'll look at the next theorist in the series of British empiricism, the Irish philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, and then we'll talk about Hume as well.